Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you had a good weekend. I did. I'm raring to go for this week of shows to commemorate, as you heard there, the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. So we're going to start with the basics on this first show, and we'll look at, it's a cheesy title. It brings people in 10 things you should know about the Imperial Japanese Navy and the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's not exclusively Japanese. We'll talk about a couple of American things as well. And I've had some bona fide military history writing legends on my channel, and I'm now having a bona fide YouTube legend because Drachinifel has just the most amazing channel about Navy history and engineering and ships and things, and just you know who he is, but the link is in the description below. Just amazing content, subscription numbers that I could dream about. But anyway, we're here to talk about Pearl Harbor. So good evening, Drac. How are you doing today?
Good evening. I'm doing very well, thank you.
So the thing about Pearl Harbor is that it is the event that catapulted the USA into World War II. So it has deep kind of emotional resonance, and the number of veterans I've met of any unit who say it was hearing that news that prompted their enlistment, their volunteering, whatever it would be. But yet it is still something we can look at from a historical point of view and say, why has this kind of myth established? Why do we think this about it? And our purpose tonight is to kind of tackle some of those myths and legends, but also remaining respectful to the fact it was a day of an insane amount of loss of life in one day. So we're going to get that kind of tone across first, folks. And as usual, if you've got questions for, it won't be for me because I don't know myself, but if you've got questions for Drac, then please fire away in the comments there. There'll be a couple of little video promos we're playing during the show, including some footage that was taken at Pearl Harbor earlier today by Marty Morgan, the historian who you may remember has been on shows about Lafayette and San Mariglis, and Marty is out there. And I'm jealous of my friends who are out in Pearl Harbor. Slightly warmer there than it is here in Normandy. I was on Juno Beach today. So anyway, Drac, you've drawn up 10 points of what you're going to talk about. We may go to others. We may skip oaks, come back to some. But the first one, I think, particularly important. So this is the idea that there had been some kind of inkling that this type of thing could happen. So what are we talking about here? By the way, we're not talking about the conspiracy theory of Roosevelt knowing about it, allowing it to happen.
No.
We're not going down that rabbit hole. We're talking about the fact that something like this could happen. So
yes,
far away.
So, yeah, as you said, we're not talking about the idea that the US knew specifically that Japan was going to attack on December the 7th, or that they even knew that the Kido Butai was at sea in the vicinity. What it is more the concept of somebody attacking a fleet at Pearl Harbor with carrier-based aircraft. Yeah. Now, the reason I say they had three major warnings was that each year, for most of the interwar period, the US would do this exercise called a fleet problem. And in the fleet problem, they'd take most of the active service ships in the US Navy and split them into two teams, usually red and blue. And they would give one team a task, and the other team's task was to stop them. So this could be anything from just a straight up battle line engagement to seek and destroy, attack the Panama Canal, all sorts of things. But in 1932 and in 1936, there were fleet problems that involved attacks on Hawaii, specifically on Pearl Harbor, which, although it wasn't the US fleet base at the time, it was an important anchorage. It was going to be the staging point for war plans that held the US Pacific Fleet should go over to the Western Pacific. And both times, the carriers involved managed to launch successful air attacks on Pearl Harbor. The second one was actually carriers under the command of Admiral King, who would later become the commander-in-chief of the US Navy for the duration of the US's involvement in World War II. And both of these attacks demonstrated that carriers could launch a surprise attack that was very, very successful on the US Navy at Pearl Harbor. And no one seems to have taken a tremendous amount of notice about this. It was kind of quietly shuffled away. One of the points that I came across when I was looking at several biographies of Admiral King is that Admiral King was one of about 3 or 4 admirals that you could really call carrier admirals. It is a little bit of a crude term, because just because Admiral King believed in carriers, that doesn't mean he didn't believe in battleships, but he knew how important carriers were. But the vast majority of the US Navy's admiralty in the 1930s were more in favor of the battleship as the primary method of naval power, and the carrier as kind of a support weapon. So they had these 2 fleet exercises. They both demonstrated how the attack could be carried out in somewhat different ways. But more importantly, the fact was that because it was an exercise, they kind of knew that something was coming. They knew that there was an enemy fleet out there, which obviously on December 7th they didn't. And yet the attack still came off successfully. So they had these warnings from their own, I guess, from their own side, if you like. And then the third major warning was Taranto, which obviously is the Royal Navy attack on the Italian fleet. Now, one of the things that happened during the Taranto operation is, although the US wasn't formally involved in the war yet, they did have a large number of US Navy officers who were operating with the Royal Navy. They were observing, they were reporting back, making comments. So yeah, the US wasn't exactly neutral at this point, because they certainly didn't have any observation and reporting officers on Kriegsmarine or Regia Marina ships at this point. And one of those officers was assigned to the aircraft carrier that launched the Taranto strike. And he saw what had happened. He saw the aircraft come back. He was there for the debriefings. He wrote up a nice report and sent it over to the US Navy. And one of the very important things that he noted was that Taranto, like Pearl Harbor, had a relatively shallow water level as opposed to the deep ocean. And one of the problems with the torpedo bomb, as it was held at the time, was that if you drop a torpedo from 50, 100 foot up in the air, it's going to hit the water, it's going to go down, it's going to go down a fair way, and then it's going to pop back up to running depth. And a lot of people had said, well, you know, Pearl Harbor is invulnerable to this kind of attack because it's so shallow, the torpedo will just pancake into the seabed and that'll be that. Taranto had basically the same defense, and the British had just proved, albeit by a different method than the one the Japanese would use, that it was in fact possible to overcome this and drop torpedoes into a shallow harbor and hit the battleships within. And the US officer in question pointed out exactly this, and he actually specifically said, you know, if somebody comes after us in Pearl Harbor, we will be vulnerable. But that report went off, it got filed away, and nothing was done. So
this is where we're into the difference between something being possible and something being likely, because they're not quite the same thing, are they? And there's already comments coming in about something being vulnerable, and Norma Gray made the point about well, I can't find, there we are. Was it specifically at Pearl Harbor? But during these operations, obviously over the course of decades, they're looking at various possibilities on where the fleet might be, what might be the attack from there. They're thinking about possibly things from Europe, things from Asia, things from this. So it's not like they're only ever thinking about Pearl Harbor as a potential vulnerable point. They're looking at lots of things that might happen. And someone, I think, where's the comment I liked there? It was from, I can't find it now. It's busy tonight, which is very good. Oh, Kurt Rowlett said, could it be said that the sheer audacity of such attack was thought to be less than likely? You know, it is possible, but
it's possible. The only thing I'd say to that is that every single time the Imperial Japanese Navy had gone to war in its modern history, it had opened the war with a surprise attack on the enemy fleet.
Right.
Or in the case of World War One, a relatively surprising attack on an enemy fleet base, because obviously they couldn't go all the way to Germany. So the idea of the Japanese opening with a strike on your fleet, possibly without actually necessarily telling you that they were at war with you just yet, shouldn't have been in fact, them not doing that would have been more of a surprise.
Yeah. Okay.
And as the Great Dominion points out in the comments, the main difference between Pearl Harbor and all the other US fleet bases, with the exception of the Philippines, was that the continental United States is out of range of enemies' capability to strike, because the only people who have enough carriers to actually think about doing it are the Royal Navy and the Japanese Navy. No one else has, well, almost no one else has carriers, and the ones who do, like France with Bern, you're not doing an effective fleet strike with Bern. And thus, they have to consider, well, these are the two other navies with large carrier forces. Yes, the Royal Navy could come and attack our Atlantic ports. It has the range, it has the capability, but let's be honest, in the 1930s, the Americans are not exactly concerned about going to war with Britain. Their interests are aligned, not opposed. So it kind of filters down to a category of one. Japan is the only nation with a large carrier arm who might want to attack us, but they also know that Japan can't come to the West Coast. So San Diego, the home port for the Pacific Fleet for most of the interwar period, is safe. But that means the Philippines and Pearl Harbor are the ones at risk. And to a certain degree, an appreciation of the risk of an attack on the fleet in harbor was kind of percolating through the Americans' thought processes, because they had abandoned the idea of forward basing the fleet in the Philippines. A lot of the interwar planning had famously called for the US fleet to surge across and base itself in the Philippines and then fight the Japanese there. By the late 1930s, that had been abandoned. They weren't going to do that anymore. But now you had these options of, well, are we going to base the fleet in San Diego? Are we going to base it in Pearl? Well, if it's Pearl, Pearl is vulnerable. They just didn't, for whatever reason, join the dots together.
But then we also know in the early part of the war that things are happening generally in all theaters that could easily be explained as being that was likely to happen. I mean, the Singapore plan, the Maginot Line, the Germans invading Poland. These are all things that you can now say, that was going to be on the cards. That was likely to happen. So the benefit of hindsight, of course, is its perfect vision. So we can kind of excuse them for not always knowing that these things are going to happen when they did and how they did, I guess, is the important thing here as well. But we did have a question earlier on about what radar they have, what radar capability they have generally in Hawaii. If you want to handle that one, we can do that.
So there's a small amount of radar capability, bearing in mind that radar is still a very, very, very new technology. There's some experimental CXAM radars being mounted on various US capital ships at the time. But obviously, if they're in harbor, it's pretty much useless because they're surrounded by hills and landscape. The US doesn't have anything like chain home or chain home low that Britain has during the Battle of Britain, in part because the US is technologically just a fraction behind on radar technology at this point, and also because, again, they're not expecting anyone to attack the continental United States, and the continental United States has a huge seaboard, so even if they somehow
how many installations would they need to cover their asses? It would be thousands.
But in Hawaii itself, they have they have a few different systems. They have the systems on the ships. They have a few that they're thinking about working on. But the one that famously features in most of the Pearl Harbor accounts is a portable unit, which they're testing. So it's not on all the time because it's not quite, but effectively stuck on the back of a truck and driven up to the top of a hill. And I haven't been to Hawaii, but I have reliable reports that tell me that even though it is nice and tropical, the top of the mountains are not the world's most pleasant places to be at night if you're not wrapped up warm. So this radar is not there permanently, but on the day it is actually up and working, and it does detect an incoming mass of aircraft. But when they report it in, they are told it's probably an incoming flight of B-17s, which were expected at some point that day. And obviously, the Japanese flight is coming from a completely different direction. No B-17 flight would be coming from that way. But what you've got to remember with the very early radars is they don't have what we call the PPI indicator, which is what everyone thinks of as a radar screen, circular thing, beam spins around, dots appear, etc. What radar in 1940 and 1941 looks like is an oscilloscope screen, and you get a spike where there's a strong return, and that's basically it. So you can tell that, well, there's a spike, it's roughly this big, From where it is along the screen, you can tell roughly how far away it is. But if you want to know where that is in three-dimensional space, you have to try and adjust your, if you've got an adjustable antenna, adjust that and see, okay, well, it's strongest over there, so it must be coming from over there. And if you've got a fixed antenna, well, you know, at X band, there is this. And that's why with the chain and chain home stuff, you had multiple stations so that they could triangulate. But this radar is just a single unit.
And this is going back to this idea about the fact that this could have happened. I think, as we said at the beginning, we're specifically talking about that it could be happened, not that there was any kind of warning about the December the 7th as the event happening. But over the years in the historiography and the fact, as we said, it is so talked about, everybody knows about Pearl Harbor. And this time of year, you get the little, 200-word articles coming out by newspapers. They've kind of got a little bit muddled, some of the journalists, between the fact that this was a possibility that could be on the cards with actually this idea that they knew it was coming. I think they've muddled the stories a little bit. And you get these repetition of frankly nonsensical stuff about, Roosevelt ignoring advice and things like that. And then when you get into those kind of conspiracy theory things, they are very difficult to derail once they become established. And I think it's out there now. And I've had people emailing me just last week saying, are you going to cover the fact that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor? And you go, no, we're not going to cover that because then I start doing a show about Kennedy being killed by whatever, Mongolian immigrants or whatever, and you suddenly become a conspiracy channel, and that's not what I want to do. So the fact that something could have happened and the fact they knew about it happening are two separate threads that have, I think, got a little bit muddled up.
That's the thing. You've got to remember with these kind of things, it's not a binary solution. You've got, we know this thing is going to happen. You've got, we know this thing could happen. And we know, and then you have, we think we know that this cannot happen. And there's gradations between those 3 points, but kind of, we know this is going to happen means you do something about it, or else you end up in conspiracyville. Most military scenarios fall under the, we think this could happen, or we know this could happen, but we don't know when or how. And that's usually where most things tend to go wrong, when they guess wrong on that. And then you have we don't think this is actually possible. And, unfortunately, whilst some, like Admiral King, had proven that, in fact, it was in that middle category of it could happen, a number of US Navy officers and other US Armed Forces personnel had kind of gradually shifted it off into the, actually, we don't think this will happen for whatever reason.
And Mike, before we move on to the next point, Chris is asking about whether or not there was any kind of realistic intercept plan should they find out something's happened, and what would that intercept plan be? Was there one is the first question, and what would it be if there was one would be the second question.
There were air defense plans for Hawaii. That's why there was the US Army Air Force fighter units deployed there. But to be honest, in terms of investigation of it's not going to make a huge difference, because there's several dozen zeros in that flight. Because the thing is, the Japanese are expecting the Americans to counterattack. The zeros are there mostly for escort. But if they had been investigating, you probably would have seen maybe 2 or 4 fighters scrambled and sent off, and they hopefully, with some guidance from the radar, would have encounter the Japanese formation. But by the time they've been scrambled, got to altitude, headed over, and actually run into the Japanese, you're probably minutes away from the attack happening anyway. So given the chain of command would have had to been, assuming the pilots actually have the time to, talk to people rather than fighting for their lives, that message would have had to go back to somewhere like Hickam. Hickam would have then had to, because it's, again, Army, would have had to communicate with the Navy. The Navy would have then had to communicate with the Fleet. The Fleet would have had to go on alert. And by that point, that you'd basically be in what actually happened anyway, bombs dropping, torpedoes, etc., with the possible slight advantage of this small flight of fighters that got swallowed up by the zeros might have disrupted their formations a bit and made it a bit more loose.
Yeah, I think so. So, and there's just a thing there about this, just to remind us about these events. But the second point, And you mentioned this already, Taranto. There is, and this is another you see that in a lot of the little things on the internet about the Japanese were specifically inspired by the achievements of the British at Taranto, and you're saying it wasn't. I mean, in fact, you just made the point that the Americans have looked at it and said, this kind of thing could happen. But yeah, that's one of those things that gets over. The Japanese were inspired by Taranto. That's where they got their ideas from. So no, basically.
Basically what happens, I mean, with Taranto, obviously, as we said, there's a US Navy observer on the British carrier. There is information trading between the Axis, although obviously at this point Japan isn't in the war. It's still allied with Italy and Germany. And so when Taranto happens, the Japanese do receive reports about it. They get more information about what's happened. They look at it with interest, but they look at it more as just kind of a confirmation of what they already knew, which is that this kind of attack is possible and can be successful. But they were already thinking about and planning for something like Pearl Harbor long before that. I mean, it's one of these weird dichotomies that you get where people, I guess, I mean, some people genuinely will just look at it and go, oh, Taranto, aircraft attack on a fleet base, Pearl Harbor later in the year, the two must be connected. It seems to make sense. But other people sometimes look at it in a perspective of, oh, well, it reflects a lot of actually some of the pre-war US intelligence attitudes of the Japanese can only ever copy things. Yeah. And I think, yes, well, clearly the superior British did it, and then the Japanese just copied it, even though the Japanese did it on a much larger scale with 6 carriers instead of 1, and used monoplanes instead of biplanes and all sorts of things like that.
There's lots of things about it that aren't similar, even though there are broadly things that are similar. There's other things you can go, it's completely different in this way, this way, this way, and this way. So
they don't use the same method for making sure the torpedoes don't hit the bottom and things like that. But the other weird thing about it is that even though some people use it as an attempt to kind of, as I say, like denigrate the Japanese achievement, they don't realize that actually in some ways they're making the Japanese out to be superhuman, because if you accepted the idea that Taranto was the starting point, the Japanese going, oh, we should do this, that would mean that the Japanese managed to put together the entire attack plan, all the operations, all the pilot training, all the weapons adaptation, because bear in mind they're adapting battleship shells into bombs as well as their torpedoes, all the fleet maneuvers, getting all the fleet supplies, and getting that whole long voyage from Japan to just off of Oahu. And they're organizing all of this in under a year, in the time between Taranto and Pearl Harbor happening. I mean, that's a superhuman feat of logistics and planning for a Navy that isn't actually at war yet. Yeah. And I mean, they're good. And they're not actually that good.
That, of course, the Japanese aren't just doing Pearl Harbor. At the same time, Singapore, everything else is kicking off as well. And that's another interesting thing about the international date line, is that some people are kind of forgetting that these events are happening concurrently with things elsewhere. But because you've crossed the date line, it is the December the 8th these things are happening, but it's happening in real time at the same time, effectively, isn't it? So
yeah,
if they had planned all this in a few months, it would be amazing. And I suppose we should really address the fact that British, Americans, Australians, we all are in 1913, late 30s, 40s. We're kind of underestimating the Japanese hugely. Their technological abilities, their everything. We're underestimating everything about what they did, which could bring us into the Singapore plan and Malaya and all those subjects there. Those early part of the war, they were doing things that we were going, we didn't know they could do that so effectively and so quickly. And we are learning, alas, very quickly ourselves that they can do these things, and they are pretty damn good, and they are adapted to these things. So it's sort of stereotyping of what we thought the Japanese were capable of.
Yeah.
Which is another.
Yeah.
We just had an interest about it's completely separate. The idea about pre-war spying on Pearl Harbor. I watched the Ben Affleck film, because we talked about that with Fighting on Film on Wednesday, and it has the dentist getting the call there about how many ships are in the harbor and things like that. We're kind of dismissing that, really, aren't we, as being really integral to their plan, are we?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the weird things. It's like, to us these days, we're used to almost everything about the military being at some level secret. You can't just wander across a military base. You can't hire a plane and fly across Norfolk Navy Yard or whatever. But although the age of complete openness in naval matters had kind of died around 1900, 1905, the first half of the 20th century, there was still a certain degree of openness, or at least a lack of active attempts to conceal things. And, Hawaii is still a relatively well-populated set of islands. And whilst the Japanese, yes, they did have some spies in the area, and they did ask them to sort of confirm and correlate things about where ships were anchored, it wasn't the kind of real-time information gathering that you see in the film, where someone phones up, oh, well, how many ships are there today? 9. Okay, great, whatever. Apart from anything, the communications lag is much greater than it is these days. I mean, like we said earlier, if the fighters manage to get information off, would it actually be of any benefit? Probably not. And then, so if you imagine, so someone in the diplomatic or intelligence service phones a dentist in Oahu, who then gives him information. He then has to encode that, transmit it. Someone in Japan has to receive it, decrypt it, hand it over to the right person in the Navy, who then has to re-encrypt it, transmit it all the way back to the Kido Butai, wherever they happen to be, hope that they receive it, decrypt it, take it up to the bridge. By the time that information gets there, it's basically useless as a real-time set of data. What they did use their spies for initially was to get an idea of the overall layout. Because there were things like pleasure flights and stuff that would fly and actually deliberately fly around the Navy base to show off, oh, look at all our pretty ships. And they could use those reports and photographs to work, sort of construct models and make plans, so they knew what the area looked like. They knew where the common anchorages were. But it was, I guess, kind of a pre-attack intelligence gathering effort, so they knew what they were attacking. It wasn't a kind of, as the movie portrays, kind of a real time, this is exactly how many ships are there. Because to be honest, if they had someone who could do that, they would have told them the carriers weren't there, and then everything would have changed.
Yeah. And essentially, the information they would get, it's refining the plan as opposed to making or breaking it. I mean, if they come in and they've been told the ships are on yay side of the harbour, they're on the other side of the harbour, is it really fundamentally going to change what these the dive bombers and what have you and aircraft are doing? Not really. It's just a little bit of extra refinement that we can pretty much say they are this side there, but is it going to make a bit of difference if they don't have that refinement, really?
Well, the one thing I would say is that in actuality, the first wave attack does actually show that they don't have this real-time capability,
right?
Because they have for the dive bombers and the level bombers, it's not so much of an issue, but for the torpedo bombers, they have to have a long run-in. And so this isn't just about like seeing a ship and going, I will attack this. They actually have to start well outside of the naval base area. And we know that a bunch of their aircraft showed up coming in from the west on a torpedo run. But if you look at Battleship Row, directly to the west of Battleship Row is Ford Island. Dropping torpedoes on an island never really works very well. Those aircraft were coming in expecting to find carriers moored on the western side of the island, which there weren't. They then had to split and kind of do I guess a kind of sideways heart-shaped maneuver to come in and come back in on the battleship runs, which didn't help their accuracy, because now they're not going according to plan, coming in dribs and drabs instead of a mass wave. There were some that came in for the battleships in a mass wave. But as I say, that what that does tell us is that those pilots, up until the moment they actually broke through the cloud cover and saw what was going on, had no idea that the carriers weren't there.
So as we can say, that the information that might have come from a dentist, but as we say, by the time it's going back, decrypted, going off, it's all too late. It's not real. It's not effectively not real time. But we've kind of dovetailed, moved nice into our next point, which is the fact that the U.S. Navy hadn't really been there that long, but prior to there, because I think that's something that people think that it's kind of a Singapore kind of thing where we've just been there for generations and generations, and it's not. Well, I'll let you explain.
Yeah. So well, I mean, Hawaii itself hasn't been under the US flag for just coming up to or just over half a century at this point. It's a late 19th century acquisition of the US. Singapore, the British acquired that a little bit further back, but
acquired it, being a very polite way of speaking.
Much as we have acquired many other artifacts from people. So Hawaii is a relatively new US possession, and as a fleet base, as I mentioned before, it's been considered for a while as a staging area for the fleet to go across, so a temporary fleet base. But it hasn't been the base of the Pacific Fleet. For the vast majority of the time in the interwar period and before, the Pacific Fleet was based in San Diego. And it was still in San Diego when what we think of World War II breaks out in 1939. The reason that the US fleet is moved up to Pearl Harbor less than a year before, obviously, the attack itself, is because it's a deterrence move. It's the president, by moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor, he's trying to send a message to the Japanese that, our fleet is closer, we're taking you seriously, knock it off with the attacks on China, etc., etc. It's not actually fully ready as a fleet base, and that they know that. There's works going on. There's new dry docks being dug to support the fleet, with repairs and refits and maintenance and such. Like, there's a reasonable amount of infrastructure there, but not enough to support the entire Pacific Fleet long term. So all that work is going on. It's not quite completed. They're still begging, borrowing, and arguing amongst themselves to improve the actual active defenses. So there's letters going back and forth. We need more anti-aircraft guns. Can we get some coastal defense guns? Can we improve the coastal defense guns that we have? What about having new fighter aircraft put in place? And bear in mind that this is a split responsibility, because the defense of Hawaii is in the hands of the Army. So the US Navy is not responsible for the anti-aircraft batteries and the fighter airfields ringing the fleet base. It is responsible for its own ships, but there is this split going on of responsibility. But everyone knows that they do need to improve Pearl Harbor for it to be a creditable fleet base, and that work is still ongoing at the time of the attack.
Yeah, and I think you made the point there about the message that the American fleet is sending to the Japanese, because this is all going hand in hand with the fact, and I think people have forgotten this, is that because Japan and China have been at it since 1937, that the economic sanctions that the US imposes on Japan, which didn't really have much of an effect, but it's like we're putting pressure on to try and get you to pull out of Manchuria and China and all this kind of stuff there. That's all going on and has been going on behind the scenes for 2 or 3 years. So there are these various delicate threads of diplomacy, stroke negotiations, stroke threats that are coming from various quarters across just to try and. It's that sense we always talk about. Everyone knows that a war is coming. It's just the when and how, where it's going to start off, and whom is going to be the first aggressor. But it's kind of by the late 30s, it's just a matter of when and how. So
yes,
these things are going on at the same time.
Yeah, the one thing you've got to remember with the sanctions, as you say, most of them, Japan kind of looks at them and literally just goes, filthy gaijin, why do we care? But the one that's really biting them of all of them, there's a few others that are a bit annoying, but they can always trade with Italy and Germany for most of that. But the big one that's biting them is oil.
Yeah.
So the US in 1941 is the world's biggest producer of oil. The second and third largest producers of oil are under the control of the UK, and which is obviously allied with the states that are going along with the sanctions, and the Dutch East Indies, which currently is kind of the last remaining bit of territory that's flying the Dutch flag, but they are also going along with it. So Japan is looking at potentially running out of oil, and the whole attack on Pearl Harbor is actually about getting control of the Dutch East Indies, which sounds very odd if you look at it on a very basic level. It's like the Japanese want Dutch oil, therefore they blow up Hawaii. But it's all part of a relatively logical chain of, if the Japanese know if we attack the Dutch East Indies to get the oil, we have to go past the Philippines. If we do take the Dutch East Indies, then we obviate the American sanctions. The Americans won't want us to obviate their sanctions, therefore they will strike at us from the Philippines. So we have to take the Philippines. So now that's another bunch of oil, because you've got the oil you'll need for your expedition to the Dutch East Indies. You need the oil you're going to need for your expedition to the Philippines. And then obviously some bright spark goes, yes, but won't the Americans send their Pacific Fleet to stop us taking the Philippines? Right. Well, if we hit Hawaii and take their Pacific Fleet out first, then They can't stop us taking the Philippines, which then means they can't stop us taking the Dutch East Indies. So now you have the oil requirements for 3 separate mass operations, plus the oil requirements for the continuing war with China, plus all the other bits and pieces I think we might as well grab at the same time. And they have to add all of that up and go, right, well, this is how much oil we need to carry all this out. This is how much we've got. And when those two figures start to become disturbingly close to parity, we have to execute these operations before that point. Because if we do it afterwards, it's not going to do us any good. If we go and attack Pearl Harbor, great. We go and attack the Philippines, great. We then run out of fuel and we can't actually go and get the Dutch East Indies.
And the weird thing is that it sounds ridiculous with the benefit of 80 years hindsight, is the Japanese kind of thought that once they'd got the Dutch East Indies and pushed everybody out, that the world would kind of go, oh, well then, okay, you've got it. They kind of thought that if they did it quick enough and took it forcefully enough and then defended this whole thing, we'd go, oh, well, yeah, that's yours then, which sounds crazy, but they kind of, I don't know, thought it or hoped it. It's just this linguistically difference.
You've got to remember that when you've got wars in the 20th century involving Japan, they've been involved in World War One, but they haven't been involved in World War One in the way that everybody else has. The Japanese didn't send hundreds of thousands or millions of men into the trenches on the Western or Eastern fronts. So they don't have the cultural memory of a knockdown, drag out total war. As far as they're concerned, World War One was some destroyers in the Mediterranean, a few raiders, and snatching up German colonies in the Western Pacific, which is all fun and games. And then the Germans gave in, so they got to keep a few of them. Fantastic for them. Their previous experience of war with the Russians, surprise attack on their base, blockade them in, fight them on land. The Russians send their Second Pacific Squadron. It gets destroyed by the Japanese Navy, and fairly shortly thereafter the Russians throw the towel in because hey, the Japanese have beaten them. They don't have any real further method of fighting on, and a peace treaty is signed. And that's more the kind of war that they've seen being fought through the 19th century. There are some fairly brutal ones like the Crimean War, but they've not lasted too long. And when somebody receives some major defeat that basically points to you can't really continue this in the short to medium term, they give up. So they're thinking of it in terms of if we hit them hard enough, quickly enough, and present them with a fait accompli that's going to be too difficult for them to overcome, especially given that Britain and the Netherlands have obviously a lot more pressing problems to deal with over in Europe, then they might just put their hands up and go, yeah, you know what, it's not actually worth it, and or we can't actually do anything about it at this time. The Japanese aren't entirely optimistic. They're fairly sure at some point someone will come back after them to try and take it off of them, but that's why their plan isn't just take the Dutch East Indies. It's this whole greater prosperity sphere stuff with fortified islands on the outside to basically let them build a ring of fortifications around their holdings and then make it too tough to crack.
And in a weird way, there's a kind of a sort of logic to their idea in that the butcher's bill the Allies paid to get back this stuff was insanely high. I mean, we talked the losses in the island hopping, the losses in the Navy battles, the air losses. It was insane how much it cost us and how long it took the Allies to push the Japanese back out of this thing there. So, and again, we've talked about it in World War II TV, as you must on your channel. We have to go back to the 1940-41 era when a lot of USA didn't want to get involved in any war at all. It was like, this is not our problem. I had the show with Michael Nyberg that fairly recently talking about Vichy France and the idea that Vichy France then losing its territories in South America then puts the pressure, hang on, that puts theoretically the Third Reich in South America, just across from us in North America. And but that was one of the things that kind of prompts the US government to take everything seriously. But there are all these people, we've talked about them, the Henry Fords, those people who let's not get involved. So why would Japan taking the Dutch East Indies? Why does that bother someone living in Chicago or California or wherever? Why is that their problem? We can kind of see a point of view back there.
Yes.
But anyway, we're digressing down a rabbit hole. But let's move on to the next point there.
Yeah.
Very few torpedo bombers in the Japanese strike force.
Yes.
Realistically, there's a photo there. So explain more.
Right. So the Japanese strikes are made up of three main types of aircraft. You've got the Zeros, the fighters, everyone knows. You've got the Vals, the dive bombers, and you've got these things, the Kates, the B-5Ns. But each Japanese wave is a little bit under 200 aircraft. So you're talking about well over 300 total aircraft committed to the operation. There are exactly 0 torpedo-armed bombers in the second wave.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first wave of approximately 180 aircraft, only about 40 of them are carrying torpedoes. The rest of them are either Zeros, which obviously aren't carrying anything heavier than a 20mm cannon round. There's some Vals with bombs. And actually, although there's just over 80 of the Kates, about half of them are instead armed with the adapted 16-inch armor-piercing bombs, which actually is what does in for Arizona. So the torpedo strike element, even though everyone, we've all seen the movies, there's always a big thing made of torpedoes going left, right, and center. But actually, that element of the whole thing is over and done with in the first wave, and actually over and done with pretty quickly, because the way the Japanese are thinking about the way they've layered their attack is obviously they think there's carriers there, but they're thinking, there's carriers and there's battleships. These are the things that merit a torpedo strike. So we'll hit them with the torpedoes, we'll punch holes in them, but once we punch holes in them, they're going to start sinking. So we've also got these big heavy armor piercing bombs. There's the Vals with their fragmentation and general purpose bombs. They're supposed to be there to keep setting things on fire, chew up the carriers a bit more, because the Japanese are aware, again, from the Russia-Japanese war, amongst others, that salvaging things that have sunk in shallow water is definitely a thing. So the Vals are supposed to use some of their 550 pounders to, once the carrier's rolled over, to just keep chewing it up to make it unsalvageable. But they're also going after a lot of other infrastructure. They're going after the air bases. They're going after some of the shore installations. And so the actual torpedo armed element, they only need to be there to put the initial torpedoes in. They're not thinking that they're going to be there dropping torpedoes all the time. And also, to be honest, torpedo bombing, even at this stage in the war, is a relatively hazardous operation. Later on, actually, dive bombing becomes even more hazardous than the torpedo bombers. But at this point, the dive bombers can come in at high altitude, and their only kind of exposed danger point is when they're coming down at a fair old clip. They drop their bomb and then they're out of there. Whereas the torpedo bombers, they have to come in low and slow, and they make very obvious targets. So the Japanese are not particularly keen on throwing hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of torpedo-armed bombers at things, because they can only do one thing, which is kill ships. And the Japanese have a lot more on their kill list on December 7th than just ships.
And we did the show with Donald Niebuhr a couple of weeks ago about the Dauntless, and it's a very risky thing and a very scary thing, hurtling towards a ship at the angles they were with. But it's primitive. It's pretty effective and a reasonably simple technique, as we know, and you've done on your channel, Alexander Clark, and what have you. Torpedoes are a technologically imperfect device for most nations throughout World War II. We could do an entire rundown on the various problems with US torpedoes, British torpedoes, heights, technology, things. They're not perfect. They don't always work as you're intending them to work. This also connects back to the fact that if Taranto was the big inspiration for this, they would be using a lot more torpedo bombers, because that's what Taranto was. So again,
Taranto's basically entirely torpedo bombers, except for a handful of flares and a couple of small bombs.
So if that was their big thing, they would be using more of it here. So we've kind of answered that question twice. But the next one there, and we're kind of into this sort of myth and legend and movies and representations, because Pearl Harbor, we talked about it, show is such a thing that everybody knows there. And again, I watched Pearl Harbor at the weekend, and all the films, the I Bombed Harbor, the Pearl Harbor, the Japanese film, Midway film, the tropes. It's kind of this idea of Zeros and going down streets there, killing up houses. It's in harm's way. There's the car that's somewhere out. I don't know where it's meant to be, on a beach somewhere, and aircraft strafing behind. Not really the reality.
No. As we said at the beginning, around about 2,000 people do die in this attack. Depending on which figures you believe, and there are a number bandied about, but although civilians do die, it's somewhere in the region of about 40 to 60.
Yeah, it's
give or take
considerably less than 100. Some people try and bump it up to about 100, but it's not. It's definitely not more than 100.
No, and the vast majority of them are firefighters.
Yep.
Who have come to help with the things that are under attack. So
they put themselves, pardon the pun, in harm's way, as opposed to being randomly targeted somewhere else. Yeah.
And a lot of those are killed by the environmental factor, the fact there's massive slicks of oil on fire and things still exploding. They're not being specifically strafed by random zeros. There's some civilian workers at airfields, at the military airfields. Obviously, they get caught up in an attack on what's otherwise a completely legitimate military target. A couple get killed or wounded at the civilian airport, albeit, trying to be completely neutral, you can kind of see why the Japanese attacked it, because yes, it's a civilian airfield, but it's still an airfield. If they blow up all the other airfields, well, the US fighters will just move to that one. And there's a couple of very odd attacks where a couple of sugar mills, of all places, get attacked. And those are actually, full-on strikes on civilian targets. There's no military connection to those sugar mills at all. And that results in a handful of civilian casualties. But if you look at the pictures of what constitutes a 1940 sugar mill, it's kind of a big hangar-shaped building with a large funnel stack. Yes, they are kind of weirdly out of the way for the most part, and someone probably should have known better, but it's not like they're screaming, "This is a civilian building, please come and shoot me," for laughs. You can kind of see why a Japanese pilot might have thought it was a construction of some military importance. So the point is, it's not that the Japanese didn't shoot up civilians. It's, as we've said here, they didn't randomly just go, "Oh, look, civilian cars, hospitals, people running around, let's machine gun those." They had more than enough military targets to be going after.
I mean, those photos of Ford Island, there's targets, installation, fuel dumps, ammunition positions, depots, roads, infrastructure, communications, all over that place there. Why waste time? Why waste ammunition on civilians? And this is where we're verging into the idea of Pearl Harbor and popular memory. And I may do a show about that at some point, like I did with Alan Allport at the Battle of Britain. It's about what actually happened at this event and what the public not likes to think, but needs to think happened to reinforce this idea. And I played in my introduction there the little bit of FDR's incredibly famous Day of Infamy speech. That there's a need now for this to be a dastardly, cowardly, evil surprise attack of the Japanese showing their ruthlessness. And we know in Singapore and Malaya there is some whole lot of shit going on by the Japanese as they're invading places, and murders and all sorts of things going on there. But Pearl Harbor, as treacherous as the attack was, it's not in the Japanese interest to start going off on civilian hunting patrols. They've got limited time over the harbor. 300 aircraft is a lot, but
if apart from anything else, if you go breaking off from your assigned area of attack, bearing in mind they're expecting US aircraft to come up and face them. If you go randomly swanning off, people they're going to think, well, I'm going to then get jumped. I'm on my own. They've had combat experience. They're not stupid. A plane that's off on its own is very likely to be shot down. You may even be misidentified by your own side because you're not in the right place. So you might get jumped by one of your own pilots. Or given the relatively confined space, and if you've been to Pearl Harbor, it feels very large. But if you're zipping around at 200-300 miles an hour above it's actually not that large an area.
Not at all. Exactly.
So if you go randomly off on your own, you might very well end up going crossways across the stream of your own aircraft, which also isn't going to end very well for you. So they have no particular interest in randomly attacking civilians. And as a couple of people point out in the comments as well, some civilian casualties are actually caused by the US, not intentionally, but when obviously they're firing a lot of anti-aircraft ammunition, especially by the end up into the sky. That's got to come down somewhere. Now, the US Navy, again, they're not stupid. They do understand it. If what goes up must come down. and the ammunition that they're using is supposed to have a fuse that once it's passed a certain distance or flown for a certain time, it will self-destruct. Now, okay, being showered by metal fragments from a 5-inch shell is not necessarily pleasant, but if you're undercover in your house or something, you'll probably be fine. But a number of those fuses don't actually work. So as well as a shower of expended 1.1-inch and 5-inch ammunition fragments coming down, you do get a few live 5-inch shells that haven't self-destructed come plunging down into civilian areas and then detonating. And, that's it's the weird thing. In naval terms, a 5-inch shell doesn't sound very much, but in land terms, it's 152 millimeter.
Yeah, it's big,
or slightly less than 152 6-inch, but it's slightly. But yeah, it's a 100+ caliber shell. It's sort of medium, verging on a heavy artillery on land. So these things, and they're frag rounds because they're designed to, burst into a cloud of fragments to kill aircraft. So these things coming down in civilian populated areas where nobody's got bunkers to hide behind is not good news for anyone who's in the vicinity.
Yeah. Well, we'll take a little break and I'll show a little video in a minute. But while we've got just do a couple of questions before we do that, we'll try and breeze through quickly. So Marks and Sparks is asking, did the IGN have plans to destroy the dry docks, and could they have?
They didn't specifically have plans to go after the dry docks in the waves that they launched. In terms of could they have, destroying the dry docks themselves, no, because the dry docks are massive, great holes in the ground. The ones that have been completed are concrete lined holes in the ground. Nothing in the Japanese arsenal could come close to really denting them. But what they could have done would be, if they had a few more torpedo bombers, perhaps, would be to put torpedoes into the dry dock gates.
Right.
Because basically the same kind, similar to what the British would do later on at the Saint Nazaire raid.
Yep.
Blow up the gates, and you can't use the dry dock. And those things will take a long time to fix. And without the dry dock, you can't repair the ships that you've otherwise damaged or sunk. So could they have? Yeah, those pilots were pretty good. I'm pretty sure at least some of them could have put torpedoes into the dry dock gates if they'd chosen to. There certainly weren't any defenses in place to stop them, but they didn't.
Yeah. And the next one is about the idea of a patrol craft encountering some kind of Japanese fishing boat out there and messages being sent. Garbled message, bad intel, or myth is your three options. Or if you want to put in a fourth there, you answer that however you want to.
I've not come across that particular one before myself, to be honest. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. But I would be very hesitant on the idea that a Japanese fishing boat would randomly have a machine gun.
Yeah.
Especially considering that the Japanese went to absolute maximum effort to keep this whole thing a secret, down to the point that their official orders were, if you think you've been spotted or you've confirmed you have been spotted in any way, shape, or form, just go home. So yeah, I don't think, given that level of secrecy and preparedness, I don't think the Japanese are going to start handing out random machine guns to fishing craft, which are then going to engage in a pointless firefight that's only going to give the whole thing away.
Yeah. Well, you convinced me on that, I think. So we'll go show a short little video, folks. Give myself a Drac a break to have a little drink. This is from Marty Morgan, who is out there in Pearl Harbor now. So it's silent footage of just across the harbor and some ships. Then Marty comes on screen and reminds us why we're talking about this week. So just a couple minutes, folks. So enjoy this, and we'll see you after the little break.
Good morning and aloha from Pearl Harbor. I'm here to observe the 80th anniversary of December 7th, 1941. Now, on that date, the Japanese attacked every military installation on the island of Oahu, but the losses were heaviest here at Pearl Harbor. In fact, Battleship Division 1 would lose 1,665 men that day, mostly on battleship USS Arizona, and you can see that memorial across the harbor behind me. Now, I don't get to come here every year for the anniversary, but every December 7th, I do stop to remember Pearl Harbor and to remember the 2,403 Americans who lost their lives that day. I hope you will too.
So I am very grateful that Marty took the time to record that there, and it reminds us that Marty, who is perfectly happy to engage for 2 hours about whether or not a guy landed on a church tower in San Mariglis on my channel, is also, as an American historian, completely humbled and completely respectful about what these events, this tragic event in Pearl Harbor. So we can go back to the discussions about the whats and ifs, but that is the reminder of what it's all about, tragically. The anniversary being tomorrow, all these lives lost. So yeah, that's a sobering bit of image there. And hopefully, folks, I'll tell you later on, there'll be some live footage being to me at various points during the day, and possibly even the morning of the 8th, because the morning of the 8th for me is, of course, the evening of the 7th over in Pearl Harbor. So I'm hoping, folks, I've got various people out there with various trips, might even get a veteran or two coming on. So tomorrow there's no scheduled shows, folks, but don't be surprised if I suddenly leap on my channel at some point because someone has dialed in from Hawaii, and that'll be great if that happens. And we're mentioning there that the oil bubbling up is from the Arizona, the Arizona tears, some people refer to it. So yeah, that's the moving thing we'll talk on. But back to Drax's point. So this is my favorite of the points you talked about, Drax. So again, coming just after seeing Arizona there and Battleship Row, that tragic loss of life, but there's a ship there in that area that you're saying its loss would have been far greater in the long term than the battleship. So explain more.
Right. So when you see annotated photos of the area Battleship Row, you'll always see all the battleships labeled. Occasionally, you'll get Vestal labeled as well, mainly because it's actually moored alongside all the rest of the battleships, except California, which is off doing its own thing. And otherwise, people might get a bit confused. What's this other non-battleship sitting therein? But look at any photo and you'll see that between California and the rest of the battleships is another ship that's virtually never labeled. And that is, as we put up, Neosho, a fast fleet oiler, something the US Navy is critically short of at this point and will remain critically short of for quite some time to come. The reason that fast fleet oilers are important is that they are the ones that can keep up with the fleet. Yeah. Now, bear in mind, that doesn't mean they can do 21 knots or even 30 knots. But what it does mean is that if they're running full pelt, they can keep up with the fleet at cruising speed. So that means that they can sail with the fleet, they can keep the fleet fueled, and, therefore the fleet's range is extended and its staying power on station is extended. The US Navy has plenty of slow oilers that can run oil to and from the continental United States to Pearl Harbor or to any other forward base, but those can't keep the fleet operational. They can only refuel the fleet at certain anchorages. Neosho is a very, very rare ship. She is actually sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea, hilariously enough, in a case of mistaken identity by the Japanese, who think she's a fleet carrier for some reason. But if she had been lost, and she's right in the line of fire, California's hit. Yeah. Every ship on the outside of Battleship Row is hit. She's right in the middle of all of it. It would have just taken one Japanese pilot with a torpedo or a couple with bombs to probably put her on the bottom. And, you look at what happens to the US battleships. Obviously, they're the ones that are sunk. They need to be recovered. But even the ones that aren't particularly damaged at all, like the Maryland, okay, she's trapped behind all the others for a bit. But as soon as she's freed, days after the attack, she goes back to the continental United States. And that's the last you hear of the Maryland's active participation in the Second World War for quite a while. Whereas Neosho is straight onto the front line supporting the fleet. So, much as I hate to, as I say, we need to keep this serious, but there is the whole meme of please stop, he's already dead. That's West Virginia. You don't need to put that many torpedoes and bombs into West Virginia. It's gone. And still the US managed to bring it back anyway, so half a dozen torpedoes, but still wasn't quite enough to keep it down. But one of those being diverted to Neosho, and the early 1942 operational history of the US Navy in the Pacific might well have been very different.
I mean, and it is that big, isn't it? I mean, I'm not big on those counterfactuals. If this didn't happen, the whole we lose the war kind of thing. And we're not being that dramatic. But folks, we have Craig Simons coming on Saturday to conclude Pearl Harbor Week. And I asked Craig, what do you want to talk about, Craig? And he said, well, if Drac's doing all the 10 things about Pearl Harbor, I'll tackle Coral Sea, because although there are other things in between it, and often Midway is labeled as the next big event, Coral Sea is, for most naval historians, the crucial event that happens. And of course, this is when the Neosho is lost there, as you say, it's the case of mistaken identity. But it is one of those things that had she gone down there, and it wasn't that no one. It was just a bit of luck, a bit of just the fickle finger of fate. Didn't conspire to lose it that day. It's right there. It's not like it's off round a corner somewhere. It's there.
No. I mean, you can see from this photo, you've got California here. And there's the Neosho right there. You can see the other battleships and Battleship Row just behind, and the smoke clouds from Arizona. Even if they're not deliberately attacking her, a miss could well have done in for her. Which is why I found it triply hilarious that, slight segue, but in the most recent Midway movie, which I don't have a very high opinion of, magically Neosho was turned into a Pennsylvania class battleship for reasons, I guess. So if they disguised her as a battleship, she might actually have ended up being sunk. But there you go.
That's a weird bit of reverse logic there, but I'm kind of with you on that. We have had the question there of why were they short of fast oilers? Just budget concerns, or lack of foresight, or everything?
Partly budget concerns. I mean, the thing is that fast fleet oilers are part of your logistics train, and whilst during most of the interwar period, everyone had been trying to cut the naval budget, the boost to the naval budget that happened once the treaty system had broken down and the US starts rearming for war is only happening in the late 1930s. For obvious reasons, one of the first things the US Navy is doing is building up its combat strength. It's building the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas. It's making plans for the Clevelands. It's throwing Hornet in. I mean, Hornet's a good example of that, actually, in as much as they're so desperate to get frontline combatants on stream as quickly as possible, although they technically have a design that will very shortly thereafter become the Essex class. They know it needs a few more months' work, and they'd rather actually just slap down another Yorktown, because they can do that now, than wait a few months for potentially a much better carrier. And so Neosho, it's that unglamorous side of things. They know they need fast fleet oilers, but it's not absolute top of their priority list. And war comes before. They do have a plan for more fast fleet oilers to be built, but war comes before those are complete and in service. And they'll start showing up later on in the war. But as with a lot of things when it comes to the early stages of the Pacific War, probably up to be honest, up to the end of 1942, a year later, there's a lot of stuff where you kind of look at it going, yes, this stuff will show up in 1943. And bearing in mind how long it takes to build and commission a ship, these things have been started before December 7th, 1941. They've been started in 1939, 1940, some in early 41. But these things are taking time to come in. And it's, as I say, it's a matter of budget and priorities, combined with the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, the US has only really just started to come off of the idea, relatively speaking, in terms of years. They've only just started to come off the idea that they're not going to go straight across to the Philippines. So when you are thinking about basing your fleet out of a large strategic fleet base, you only really need the slow fleet oilers to keep those stocked and a few fast fleet oilers to keep the fleet on station. It's only when you're confronted with a situation like a war in the Pacific as it turns out to be, and as the US is beginning to appreciate at the end of the 1930s, where you're going to have to be operating at long distances, keeping fleets on station away from major anchorages for a long time. That's the circumstance where you need the fast fleet oilers. And all of this is changing very quickly. And it's just a case of priorities for the US Navy.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Nyberg on my Vichy France show in the fall a few weeks ago made the point that as far as Americans considering that Pearl Harbor being the big starting point for them of World War II, it's actually the fall of France, because that's when all the meetings happen. That's when Senate and Congress go, build more ships, build more this, and the budget goes from 3 and 6 to 14 million in a matter of a few days, and the budget they agreed to. But that's May, June 1940. I mean, we're talking barely 6 months later. The results of this are not going to be coming through yet. As you said there, some of this stuff doesn't come through till 42, 43, even 44. The real benefits of the cranking up of everything, which is why when we talk about people like with Ian Toll at the end of the war, why there's so much stuff now by 1945, because basically all the orders have finally finished. It's finally come through. So it's a lot of stuff about that. And
the big fleet carriers, everyone likes to have a good joke about the swarm of Essex class. USS Essex is well under construction the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
She's been under construction for a while. She won't show up in the fleet until the beginning of 1943. But that's because it takes years to build a ship.
It's on the line, yeah. This isn't building Sten guns in a plant in Birmingham. This is ships that take a bit longer than that. So, but we'll move on with talking about oil and tankers. We're on to the resupply, and again with the focus on the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's always about the deadliness of the actual strikes, the as we said there, the zeros but actually there's a lot of planning in behind it, which again comes back to our point we made of if they've just suddenly borrowed this from Taranto, putting it all together, because resupply, logistics, anyone knows anything about the Pacific campaign or the Mediterranean, it's all about logistics. It's all about resupply. And the Japanese, in addition to having pretty good carrier forces and what they can do as a strike force, they've got this bit fairly well sorted out, haven't they? And have done for some time. So they're pretty good in this regard. Give us a bit more information.
Yeah, so a lot of, I would say a common misconception is that when it comes to the Pacific War is that the US Navy were the only people who knew how to do decent resupply at sea, and that when the British Pacific Fleet shows up in 44, 45, they have to learn from the Americans, and the kind of unspoken assumption is therefore they're the only two navies who know how to do it and no one else does. And whilst it's true that the Royal Navy in 44, 45 does have to learn a bit more about the side-by-side method of refueling at sea and resupply, which is what the US uses as opposed to the stern-to-bow method the Royal Navy uses, that much is true. But in 1941, Japan, as you said earlier, has been at war with China in whatever season 28 of the Sino-Japanese War. They've been at war with them for quite a few years. They've had an idea about what it takes to operate a fleet off the Chinese coast, which, okay, yes, it is closer to Japan than Hawaii is, but it's still a fair old distance. It's not close enough for them to just be shuttling back and forth to refuel. So they have had experience with keeping a fleet at sea using oilers. And this is also how they get to Pearl Harbor. Because you look at the ships that they take as escorts to the carriers, and also look at the carriers themselves and their fuel consumption, both at cruising and at maximum speeds. And very quickly, you'll realize that a good chunk of the ships that are in that fleet cannot possibly make it to near Hawaii and back again on one tank of fuel, given the speeds that they're traveling at, both cruising and at operational speeds towards the end. And the only reason they're able to make this journey is because the Japanese have oilers accompanying the fleet, and those oilers are capable of refueling the fleet at sea, and therefore keeping everybody's tanks topped up and allowing them to conduct the operation. Granted, it is pushing the limits of their logistics system, of what they can do, but they are able to do it, and with a fairly substantial force at that. The reason you don't really see this capability really show up very much during the rest of World War II is partly because the Japanese have places like Truk and Rabaul which are their forward operational bases for a good chunk of the early part of World War II, so they can use slow oilers to resupply those places, and then the ships will fuel there. And then later on, obviously, they're being pushed back. And when you're being pushed back, your supply lines are shortening. You don't really have a reason to maintain this. Plus, of course, once they sort out their issues with their torpedoes, the US subforce has something to say about the floatability of Japanese fleet oilers.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting to hear about this aspect, because I see we don't talk about it enough, and of course we could do an entire side conversation about how, as the war goes on, the Japanese ability to transport anything is reduced and reduced and reduced. And if, in my burgeoning interest or understanding of the Pacific theater, I'm realizing it's the loss of Japanese transports, 42, 43, 44, that's making as much difference impact on their ability to wage war as it is the losing of carriers and actual warships. It's just that, by the fact they're transporting supplies by submarine, you think if that's what you're resorting to get supplies, you're kind of, it's game over, folks.
Yes.
If that's where you're at now, which they are quite early on in the war, they're really reduced in their ability to move stuff around, aren't they?
An awful lot of Japanese situations, like you say, coming up with cargo carrying submarines and things like this, they fall into what I've termed the Issei paradox. Which is a little invention of my own. So the Issei was a Japanese battleship. They converted it into a hybrid carrier, and I've pointed out on my channel before, yes, there are theoretical niches where you could make a battle carrier work. The problem is that those niches only exist in a situation where you're already probably doomed.
Right. Yes.
So
okay. Yeah.
it's the same kind of thing with your cargo carrying submarines. As you said, you're like, yes, well done. You've invented the cargo carrying submarine. Just exactly how bad is the situation that it's forced you to invent a cargo carrying
This
submarine?
is the idea for those who are watching this who are big James Holland fans, which there are some that we have ways. His idea, he talks about, of the restrictions of poverty and the freedom of poverty and the restrictions of wealth, in that the Allies, by a certain point in the war, it takes us a long time to get all of our stuff there because we've got so much of it. And the Germans with their improvised camping groups in Normandy and things like that, and the Japanese, it sounds really good, but it means actually you're struggling. It means on the grand scheme of things, if that's what you're resorting to, it's inventive, but it's inventive born out of necessity because everything else is going to pot around you. So it's something to admire, but also not admire in the sense that why have you allowed yourself to get into that situation? Again, there's another whole side topic we can go into that, but we'll move on to the next point there. Back to Pearl Harbor again, back to December the 7th, follow-up attack nobody noticed. That's a lovely little title there. So over to you, Drac.
Right. So once the Kido Butai had the Japanese fleets turned around and gone home, they are needed for a lot of other things. They've got the advance on the Philippines, they've got the advance on the Dutch East Indies. Eventually, they've got the Indian Ocean raid as well to go on. But there's a lot of stuff in the Western Pacific that's crying out for attention. Plus, the carriers need to refit, etc. So the carriers aren't coming back to Pearl Harbor for a good long time. But they do realize that the US will begin salvage work. And they're trying to think of a way to disrupt that, to prolong how long these ships stay out of service, B, possibly hit some other ships that have now come in, and just generally kind of like the naval equivalent of suppressive fire. But without the carriers, they're a little bit stuck because they don't, a land-based bomber, as long range as a G3M or G4M is, there's no way that they can launch even from somewhere like Wake Island, that you're not going to reach Pearl Harbor. It's not happening. And eventually someone hits on this somewhat crazy idea, but also so rather wonderful. They have some very big flying boats. And they think, right, they can fly very long distance, still can't fly long enough, but if we have a small contingent of ships with some fuel aboard, and we'll place them on an atoll, or not on an atoll, but in an atoll, and then we'll fly the flying boats to them. They can refuel, and then they can fly over to Pearl Harbor. They can bomb it, and they can repeat the stages and all come back. Sounds great in principle, but in a lot of ways, it turns out to be. It has parallels to the Black Buck raids that the Royal Air Force would pull off in the Falklands. So yes, it is technically possible to do. Yes, they successfully managed to do it, but you can only get a very, very small number of aircraft to actually pull it off. In this case, it's two. To actually make it there. And as I say, the stinger being no one actually notices because, one, it's a very small air raid, and two, believe it or not, despite the fact, Pearl Harbor, as we say, is not exactly the world's smallest facility, they actually miss it completely. And not as in they fly over and drop bombs on it and the bombs go astray. They do not find the harbor. They manage to find Hawaii, so they bomb some random parts of Oahu and then go home. But no one's expecting someone to bomb a random mountain slope or anything like that. And the flying boats are flying pretty high because they're worried about being intercepted by fighters. So after a few days, everybody's very confused about where these new craters have come from. And it takes them a long time to actually figure out, some Japanese aircraft came. Oh, well, they can keep doing that if they like. We don't care. And the whole thing kind of just, the Japanese realize it wasn't very effective as well, and they kind of give it all up. But yes,
what date was this?
This was shortly after. This was in early 1942. This is whilst the salvage efforts are still going on. But yeah, it's just a little interesting footnote. The Japanese did try to follow up and exacerbate the damage they've done. It's just, I don't think you can get worse than we managed to attack you, but it was so pathetic an attack, no one actually realized we'd been there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and another point really is there's also psychologically, there's that kind of shock period that the USA is in that lasts certainly weeks, if not even a few months, where it's because we know this event happened. We see it on our timeline of World War II, but there for it was a shocking event when it actually happened. The world was shocked by it, just as they were shocked by everything happening across the international date line in Singapore and everything else. So, but it was deeply wounding, deeply shocking, and the people were kind of in that raw state, like after a natural disaster or something today, when you can't get any good comments out of the news crews go out to these places like when a volcano entered, and even 2 days later, you can't get any coherent sentence out of these people because they're still processing the whole thing. And so I suppose generally there's a real wounded period after this where the whole world is just, I can't deal with more trauma right now. Give me time to move on, which is an interesting kind of subject on the sideline. But we'll move on because we're ever pressing. This is another one. This is another really interesting thing that I have to say I didn't know this until you pointed out to me. So one of the most famous pictures of Pearl Harbor doesn't actually show the USS Arizona exploding. And I tested, when you sent me the list of points, I tested this. I did various search strings, US Arizona, Arizona on fire, Arizona Pearl Harbor. And this next photo comes up usually. And it's this one here, folks. So what is it?
Right. Well, as you say, this photo shows up in almost every article, video, etc., that's ever been done about Pearl Harbor. And as you say, a lot of the time people attribute it to Arizona. Thankfully, slightly less over the last few years. But even a couple of years ago, you could legitimately find copies of this labeled USS Arizona explodes at Pearl Harbor. This is, in fact, a much smaller ship, believe it or not, given how spectacular the explosion is. This is the destroyer USS Shore, which had the grave misfortune to actually be in a floating dry dock YFD2. And so it's completely out of the water, and the Japanese bomb it and the dry dock, and one of the bombs sets off its magazine. And so what you're seeing here is the magazine of the destroyer cooking off. But obviously, because it's contained in the dry dock but not in the water, you're basically getting the full unmitigated effects of the destroyer's magazine cooking off, which, amusingly enough, again, given the violence of the explosion you're seeing here, the Shore is totaled, but they do salvage it later on. They have to clear the dock, and YFD2 as well, which, YFD2 is the thing in which this explosion is taking place, is also refloated and brought back into service later on. The smoke clouds behind are from Battleship Row.
Yeah.
But this explosion itself is not.
Yeah. And as I anticipated and hoped, most of the audience had already, before we said it's the USS Shore, it's a Shore,
Yes.
and I'm sure your audience would know the same thing. But we're in that slightly niche market of people who actually know their stuff, and I'm very grateful that my audience have read widely, and they've read Ian W. Toll, and they've read all these things there. But your average person who just looks up and as Marty very respectfully said, people should think about this event on December the 7th, is that people often will just read that newspaper that puts out the little anniversary thing, or I get it in Normandy, the June the 6th, there's the little report about Normandy. I think we may have talked about it on the channel before, about the big naval actions, the big stories from World War II are the most popular ones, but they are the ones where myth and legend and all that all gets caught up in the picture. And I'm sure you find that when you're tackling something more obscure, people take on board that information much quicker because they haven't got a frame of reference that's wrong that you have to put right first. Whereas, say, not so much our audiences, but with the Pearl Harbor, all this myth and legend stuff is in people's heads. So that image, whether we like it or not, and I always do research. I try and do research for bad history as well as doing search for good history, because it's bad history spreads further than good history. And I kind of look on the less obvious kind of, entertainment sites about how are they acknowledging Normandy, how are they acknowledging the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and this photo just comes up every single time. US Arizona blowing up at Pearl Harbor. So
which is especially ironic considering we actually do have a number of, well, given what's happening at the time, you hesitate to say good, but we do have a number of high quality photos of images, Arizona exploding and some film footage. It's just, this is just for all the tragedy it's representing, it's a damn good photo.
Yeah, aesthetically, it tells a story, that photo in itself, and that's, I guess, why it spreads around, and it's like we talk about so often on our channel, the photos of that people use where they crop it to tell a story. They're trying to get this convey that this is costly, this is deadly, this is that. And when historians kind of sometimes jump on these threads on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and say, actually, this isn't what you're purporting it to be. The one that does the rounds is the photo that's actually taken off Operation Torch of American troops in the landing guard. People will use that as a D-Day photo, and they'll say things like, within minutes of this photo being taken, most of these guys were killed on Omaha Beach. And if I or someone else like Brad watching this is actually, that's not Omaha, that's Torch. People go, how dare you disrespect the point of what we're trying to say? And you go, yeah, we applaud the point of what you're trying to make, but you're using an incorrect photo to make the point. So therefore, your point is invalidated by the bad use of photo. But so
I'm fairly sure, to be honest. It's one of the things we have to remember, because slightly somewhat connected to what you just said. We are looking at a tragedy on a grand scale that's happening here, but one of the things we also have to remember is these were people just like you and me, and an awful lot of people, especially in the military, have some pretty gallows humor going on and will usually find a way to laugh at most things. And I do remember at one point, what you said reminded me of another incident. These days, probably less common given just the time and obviously people passing over natural causes. But I do remember being at an event in the 1990s, back when the old overhead slide projectors were a thing, and someone put a photo up, and they said, this is, I think it was of a tank crew, and there were veterans and all sorts, a big audience. And he said, right, this is a tank crew. He said, these guys are going into action in Normandy, and none of them would make it a week past this time of this photo being taken. And this old gentleman with a chest full of medals and a stick stood up and went, no, I didn't. I'm still here. Which rather put the back of it.
Is the one with the modern photo of British paratroopers on one side of a C-47, and then the black and white photo from the war on the other side, where it says that these are the same men sitting in the same aircraft, and you go, but no, because they're not the same people, because they've got multiple different cat badges in the photo. It's a photo taken, I think, in Colchester in the C-47 they've got there, and they use it for normally, but it's an Arnhem photo on the right. Everything they say about the photo, like Luke Skywalker says everything you said there is wrong, and yet it does the rounds every single year. It comes out there, and look, it's the same people in the same. It's not, none of those things are true, but anyway, this brings us up to kind of the next point and the last point, which slightly not contentious, but again, there's so much emotional baggage when we come to Pearl Harbor, and there's all this loss of life that we're not in any way disrespecting. But because these events, just because these events are emotionally resonant, doesn't mean you can't look at them and, as historians, 8 decades later, and say, you know what, we can make this point, and we're not offending anybody making it. So, this Americans might be recoiling in horror at this one here, but yeah. A number of battleships were sunk as much by poor maintenance as by bombs and torpedoes. So I'll let you explain that one. Again, we're doing it with all the level of respect that is necessary, but you've got a point to make.
Yeah. So one of the things is that, yes, the US battle line was quite substantial in terms of numbers. It had not been kept up and maintained the best during the interwar period. The Royal Navy, the Italian Navy, the Japanese Navy had all modernized their ships either at least once, quite often more than once. And Queen Elizabeth, for example, went through 2, depending on the ship, 2 to 3 major refits. And a number like the Queen Elizabeth's, Renown, the Caio Duilio and Andrea Doria classes, the Congos obviously had gone through major modernizations. The US battle line hadn't. They'd had some upgrades during the interwar period, but you can see even from this photo, a number of them are still sporting the cage masts from the World War I period. A few have tripods, but not all. As I say, they've had some care and attention, but nothing like the level that most other navies have put into their fleets. Now, they are planning on doing this. Colorado, for example, part of the Pacific Fleet, not present at Pearl Harbor because a few weeks earlier she'd sailed off to the continental United States to begin a full-scale modernization, which she would actually receive, and would actually form the prototype for all the other modernizations of the ships once they're salvaged. But the rest of the fleet that was there, most of them hadn't seen a major refit or any kind of modernization for almost a decade. And that meant that things were breaking down, things were wearing out. Things had, partly through lack of money, just hadn't been maintained as well as they should have been. And whilst you do get the whole thing, all the hatches were open because it was a Sunday, etc. The Pearl Harbor attack took place over the course of hours. And even though everyone's surprised, when action stations is called, the US Navy crews aren't idiots. They know to close up hatches at least as best they can. Now, granted, some ships, like I said before with West Virginia, nothing saving West Virginia. You could have closed and welded every single hatch shut on West Virginia, and it's still going down because basically its port side ceased to be below the waterline. But ships like Nevada and California were hit relatively lightly by weapons that let water in the bottom, which is how you sink ships. Nevada did get bombed a bit afterwards, but you don't sink a ship by blowing apart small bits of its superstructure. But what happened, for example, on Nevada was, they got underway, they'd been hit, all that internal hatches and bulkheads and everything were closed. They were trying to get out to sea, but they had the leaks from the hits they had taken. But what they discovered was it didn't matter with the bulkheads being closed because there were cables and pipes and welds and rivets and things and all sorts of things piercing through the bulkheads that just hadn't been maintained properly, and the water was coming through those.
Yeah, and
the bulkhead doors were pretty much the only thing that were watertight.
Yeah, to clarify, we're not saying that individual crew chiefs and what have you are not doing their job and dismissing. We're saying that the jobs they're doing are not possible because, as I say, rubber on seals has gone. Things are barely. They're trying to do what they. It's not human failings at that level. It's well, it is in the sense that the maintenance hasn't been planned on a higher level. It's just that things are failing, and things that they are doing just aren't working. So pumps aren't fuel. The fuel pumps issue came up. Hoses came up, all these various things came up in the sidebar there. So we're not accusing anybody of shirking their duties on those ships in Battleship Row. That we're talking about paying the price of a poor updating program over the previous decade or more that has left these ships generally in state of a bad need of modernization.
Yeah. And to be fair, some of them, and this kind of, again, it shows you how unexpected this attack was, because some of the ships that were in the worst state, like Nevada, Oklahoma, etc., these were the older ships. They weren't planning on keeping them in service for much longer. They were supposed to be replaced by, in Nevada's case, one of the South Dakota class when it came online. They weren't expecting a war. They were just doing a replacement program. And so in that sense, they kind of made a gamble of, we don't want to spend the extra money sprucing up a ship that's going to go to the scrapyard in a year or two anyway. So why bother? Except that then, in that time span, it comes under attack, and then the bill comes due for that neglect. And some ships were better maintained than others. And as we said, some ships were just hit hard enough, nothing would have saved them.
It's a catalogue of things.
It's a catalogue of different things, but a few of them were let down by poor maintenance.
And it's come up in the sidebar there, not keeping up regular replacement of seals and hoses meant the ship isn't watertight, and so footage damage control is not possible. And this is the thing that I wonder whether, had the YouTube been around 60 years ago, for example, that 20 years after this event, would we be able to have these discussions without people wanting to kind of, string us up in trees? How dare you say this? We're into 80 years beyond now. I think we should be able to discuss this and be honest about things. We're certainly honest about the failings of the British Navy at various times. We're honest about the failings of all of our various allied nations. The Canadians get lots of things wrong. We get lots of things wrong because Canadians watching this. It's just we're in the process of analyzing it now to see what we can learn about this, so we can understand these events with a more complete picture. That's where we should be now.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, for me, what it comes down to with these kinds of things is the U.S. Navy itself acknowledged these faults. The US Navy didn't sit there and go, oh well, we don't know how that happened. Anyway, moving on. I did a 3-part series last year on the salvage efforts at Pearl Harbor. The US Navy learned a huge amount. I mean, they were already compiling reports 24 hours after the attack came in, figuring out what had gone wrong, but whilst they were doing the salvage efforts, they came across a lot of these issues or corroborated what had been stated by the crews. And they went through all their procedures and started revising them. So, the neglect that happened, that wasn't allowed to happen again. Where they looked at where the damage had spread, sort of even systems that had failed they hadn't thought should fail. Okay, well, if that happened, how do we fix that? And so vast amounts of data were generated, processed, and then put into the service. Circulars and leaflets and all sorts were sent through the fleet. This is how you used to do it before. We know it doesn't work now. Do it this way instead. We've learned through hard experience. Basically, don't let the loss of life of your shipmates and other service members go to waste. And if the US Navy is capable of doing that within 3 to 6 months of the attacks themselves, I don't think it's any particular disrespect to point out that these were issues in the first place, because if they weren't issues, they wouldn't have had to correct them. And to their credit, you see that happening all through the war. You see Coral Sea, Lexington turns into a massive fuel air bomb, and one of the crew members on Yorktown looks at it and goes, I know exactly how that's happened. Goes to his captain and says, yeah, probably don't want that to happen. How about we do this instead? Captain, yep, great, go for it. Get back to Pearl Harbor. The senior staff look at it. Yep, brilliant idea. Circulate it through the fleet. And then from that point onwards, apart from WASP, which has its own design issues, which we won't go into here, but apart from WASP, no other US aircraft carrier suffers that level of catastrophic fuel air bomb detonation that Lexington does. A few of them suffer some pretty nasty hits thereafter, but no one's lost the way that Lexington is. And it shows the adaptability. It's yes, they're adapting, but the only reason you're adapting is because there were mistakes in the first place. So,
and we all know you learn the most from your mistakes. That's just a human thing, let alone a military thing. It's just, you learn most from when things go wrong. And I think people are understanding that that the damage control systems improve, things improve there. And the way I like to talk about it is the wearing of hats as an avid hat wearer. I had it today. I was out on a Canadian tour with a Canadian chap. I said there'll be some points in the afternoon where you're having your emotional hat on, and it's when we're going to the Abbey Dardenne, where Canadians were shot in the back of the head with their hands wired behind their back by the 12th SS. But then the analytical hat is when you're examining the losses the 12th SS are losing in terms of Panther tanks, and that actually this is turning the overall Battle of Normandy in the favor of the Allies because the Germans can't replace Panther tanks and Mark IVs and what have you. And the same thing can happen there. There's an emotional story about Pearl Harbor, which is the loss of life, and it's the images we're going to be seeing hopefully tomorrow of I think there's 63 American veterans, not obviously all of Pearl Harbor, out there in Hawaii. And they're going to be there, and we'll see their faces of how they're reacting to thinking about the 80th anniversary. That's the emotional response. And yet we can still say, but look at what the improvements were made. Look at how they learned about seal doors, hoses, damage control. And as you said, because these events would have happened pretty much the day after this event, the Navy are now already writing out reports, and the Army who were on the airfields are saying, what can we learn from this? What should we do? Because if you don't, you made the point yourself, you're disrespecting the lives of lost. If we can't take this and use this to make ourselves better, then it's been a waste. It has been a waste of human life. If we can take these ideas and build on it and save more lives in the future, it hasn't all been in vain, I guess, is the point.
Yeah. And as you say, you have, everyone's going to have a different reaction. So for us, we are not American, so Pearl Harbor isn't necessarily going to have the same emotional impact as it will with a lot of our viewers. And equally, even breaking it down onto a smaller scale than that, if I was to go to Jutland, for example, or go to the sea above the site of the Battle of Jutland, I can appreciate on a technical level and on an analytical level the impact of some of those battle cruisers exploding. But there's a certain level beyond which I can't go, because it's a thing that happened to me. But to someone who maybe had a relative there, maybe an older person who maybe had a father or grandfather there, for them that patch of ocean will mean an awful lot more than it ever will to me. And equally, someone might go to Scapa Flow and look at the wreck of Royal Oak, and people might go, oh yeah, Gunther Preen, U-47, fantastic bit of skill, or Royal Navy, not particularly good at the whole anti-submarine defense element, and they've got a very technical view of it. For me, I look at it and go, yes, I acknowledge that. That's also the last resting place of one of my great uncles. So I'm going to be a lot more emotionally invested in that wreck.
It's reading
than
the
with
room
another
for the occasion, isn't it? If you were at Jutland, or if you were in Taranto or Mediterranean, you felt, as you do on your channel, with some incredibly detailed descriptions about the change of a hull design, or the change of a fuse on a shell that makes a difference there. If you're standing there with a guy who's dropping a wreath to where his dad was killed, that's not the moment you go, of course, this is when they changed from the Mark 6 to the Mark 7. That's not the occasion. The occasion for that is your channel, when you've got people who can ask those questions. And I like to think that there are people who are watching this, like Brad from his On This Day in Canadian Military History channel. You can kind of separate that. This is the time to be emotional. This is the time to be analytical. I did it with my Dieppe shows in August. That it's an incredibly emotive subject for Canadians at Dieppe, but you can still say, okay, let's respect the loss of life, and now let's look at where errors were made with planning and separate those things. It's interesting. But before we kind of finish, any final things? The 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor is tomorrow. You're giving us the 10 points there, but are we finished with our study of Pearl Harbor collectively, or of what we can learn from it, or are there still things as naval military historians we can take from it and push it and investigate to a greater level?
I think that there's definitely still a lot to learn from Pearl Harbor, even if we just restrict ourselves purely to the historical research side of things. There's still believe it or not, still a number of unsolved mysteries, and some that may never be completely solved. One of the more recent ones that's cropped up is the use of Midget submarines. So we know that they were there. We know the Japanese launched them. And in the last few years, there's been some discussion about whether or not one of them, because the traditional historiography says that actually they went in, but none of them actually did anything. They all just sank or got scuttled. But some of the more recent historiography and research has suggested that maybe one of them actually managed to successfully launch its torpedo during the attacks on Battleship Row.
I think it may have come up in a sidebar early on as a suggestion. I can't remember that far back.
So
possibly.
whether or not that happened, personally, I'm not going to rule it out. I haven't seen anything that's 100% convincing either. And as I said, to be honest, we may never know completely, but it's still something that could stand to have a further look had. And, there's lots of these little technical aspects, like why did this happen? How did that happen? Did this thing happen or not? Or have we even misattributed this thing happening to someone else? Even something as simple as Arizona, everyone knows, yes, Arizona exploded. And why did Arizona explode? Someone dropped a bomb on it. Okay. Exactly how that bomb went from on plane to close enough to the magazine to set it all off, that bit is still under discussion. There's various theories as to how that bomb got there. So there's lots of the technical stuff to still learn about Pearl Harbor, but I think also more broadly there's a lot more to learn about Pearl Harbor in context, because it's far too easy to just use it as the turning point.
Yeah,
and just say, before December 7th, 1941, the US wasn't interested in being at war with anyone, even if they were kind of on the British and French side already to a degree. And then after December 7th, it was full bore, crush Japan, crush Germany, crush Italy.
It's binary. It's like it's a switch went on. It's not. Turning points are a risky thing to use in that context, because if you start putting one in, you end up putting 307 turning points, and then suddenly you're defeating the object of trying to get people to convey what a turning point is. There are lots of turning points.
So the context of Pearl Harbor and what happens before and after, leading up to and as a result, I think that's definitely something we still need to learn a lot from. And I say that's just restricting us to the historian side of things, let alone how you might apply the lessons of Pearl Harbor to today. However you want to interpret that, but personally, I think there are probably a few lessons that we can learn from Pearl Harbor that will apply to these days, and unfortunately a lot of them are not the nicest ones in terms of there's some stuff you can learn from Pearl Harbor that's quite positive. There's some stuff that, whilst tragic, leads to good things, and unfortunately at the moment I think some of the bigger lessons from Pearl Harbor are ones about underestimating your opponent and certain entrenched attitudes about other people that were on display and in a way contributed to what happened and seem to be coming around again.
Yeah. We just got the question there that you could do a study about Pearl Harbor as simply an example of fake news, disinformation, the various Roosevelt new theories. So you could simply look at it from the conspiracy theory idea behind it, because these things have incredible mileage. I only got 3 or 4, I think it's 4 emails I got from people saying, "Oh, you're doing this for Pearl Harbor Week," and 3 of them were about, "Are you covering the fact that Roosevelt knew about it?" And the way they implied the emails was that they believed that Roosevelt knew about it. It was that I should be covering this because it is a fact, and I was kind of, well, I'm not going to be covering it because A, I'm not, and B, let's not go down there. This is the
thing.
Really.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's like with the thing that always amuses me is the sheer number of different conspiracy theories you get around things like this, all of which insist they must be true. And I know it was a satirical article, but I think it was The Onion at one point years ago. They basically came up with an article that agglomerated all the conspiracy theories around the JFK assassination. And so it was basically JFK is assassinated in a half hour full assault of gunfire from practically everybody within a half-mile radius of the motorcade. And it's the same thing. It's like if you believe all the conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor, then it would appear that Roosevelt knew, Churchill knew, Kimmel knew, Admiral Kidd, I think was it Admiral Kidd on the Bridge of Arizona. He apparently somehow knew and still decided to get immolated for whatever reason. Practically everybody apparently knew that Pearl Harbor was happening, except possibly for the Japanese themselves, who and the rank and file crewmen on the ships, which it kind of shows how far people can get and run away with themselves.
Yeah, no, definitely. We'll just do a couple of questions if you don't mind, and then we'll let. So Jeff Rubinoff is asking, how long was it before we accepted that they might have a better, longer range torpedo than us? I'm guessing
yes, the long
that's
lance.
we are the us and the Japanese are the them in this case.
Yes. In terms of knowing, there were some intelligence reports beforehand that were dismissed. When you get into probably the early to mid part of 1942, there are certain US commanders who are writing in their reports and their analysis that they believe the Japanese torpedoes are considerably more capable than everybody else's. Some people within the US Navy are beginning to believe them, but as an institution, it's still denied. It's only really towards the very end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943 that there starts to be a widespread acceptance from on high of just exactly how capable those weapons are. I mean, one of the incidents that bears into that, apart from the Guadalcanal campaign, is the related loss of USS Wasp. That actually forces a fairly major reassessment because the Japanese submarine fires a spread of torpedoes. It hits Wasp, Wasp goes up, but the torpedoes that missed Wasp keep going, and one of them punches a massive hole in USS North Carolina's bow, and another one keeps going and hammers a destroyer that eventually will sink. And people are sort of adding up the ranges and going, well, there was an entire small fleet here that saw these torpedoes were still under power. They weren't coasting. And, they can kind of trace it back. And, well, the submarine was roughly here. That is far, far too long. And, oh, right. Something doesn't add up here. And that combines with a bunch of other stuff that they've learned from Guadalcanal and a few other incidents. And then eventually sheer weight of evidence at that point begins to sink in.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, we've got two questions that are kind of the same question, really. Peter O'Connell is asking, any comment on the scapegoating of the Pearl Harbor commanders? And Trent Telenko, who's Mr. Radar, is asking, the real unexamined pre-Pearl Harbor issues of the relationship between FDR and Admiral Richardson. Said Admiral was fired for saying the move to Pearl Harbor would leave the fleet vulnerable. So this is about, generally, the question would be any comments about commanders losing their jobs before, during, after Pearl Harbor, scapegoating. Any particular reactions?
So with Richardson, I mean, Richardson does say this is a bad idea. Pearl Harbor's vulnerable. He's probably, he's paid attention to some of these warnings.
Prevailing wind, yeah.
But unfortunately, as we mentioned, the move to Pearl Harbor is mostly a political exercise, not a military one.
Yeah.
And so effectively what he does is, although he's got good reason for it, he sticks his neck a little bit too far into the political spectrum of going from Mr. President, I think this is a bad idea, to Mr. President, you shouldn't do this, to Mr. President, I'm not going to do this. At which point the president just effectively goes, well, you work for me, and if you're not going to follow orders, well, off you go. So, I mean, as I say, he had very good reasons for doing so, but things are what they are, unfortunately. But when it comes to the scapegoating of the actual people on site, so General Short and Admiral Kimmel, Army and Navy respectively, in some ways they do get a bit of short shift, mainly because ultimately, when you're looking at a disaster on the scale of Pearl Harbor, you've got the two guys in charge, you put them up on court-martial. The minute you do that, there never really is going to be any other result, is there?
No.
You can't put two people on trial for something of that scale, and they're the people in charge, and then turn around and say, actually, no, they're innocent, they didn't do anything wrong, because everyone's just going to go, look, clearly someone did something wrong, and if it wasn't them, then who? So, they do have a bit of a problem there in that there is never going to be any other verdict once that court-martial begins. Whether they deserved it or not, that is something that I think historians are still arguing over to this day. The weight of evidence, as far as I've seen, suggests that Short probably deserved the upbraiding a bit more than Kimmel did. They both, I mean, ultimately, the buck stops at the commander, so they are responsible to that degree. There were failings within the defensive preparations of both the Navy and the Army, so they should answer for those. Whether they're entirely responsible for the overall impact of Pearl Harbor, that's, I think, is where the argumentation lies, because some of it, as we've talked about, is long-term neglect that even they are not going to be able to do
it's
anything
institutionalized
about.
Errors rather than their particular fault, in a sense.
But it's kind of where does the institutional weaknesses end and where does the active on-site weaknesses begin, and how much weight goes into those? I think that's where you make an individual judgment as to how much you
and
think
we're
each
into
of
this
them is
idea
liable.
about responsibility and blame and the difference between those two words and the similarity between these words. And again, being a Normandy guy, I bring it back to Eisenhower's memo broadcast he might have read out after D-Day if it had been a disaster, where he accepted responsibility for it, which is not the same thing as being to blame for it not working, but accepting that he's at the top of the pyramid. There's nowhere else to go up. If I lose a tooth on a McDonald's burger, technically it goes right the way up to whoever to Ronald McDonald himself. I don't know. So he's not to blame, but he's at the highest position. So he's responsible. So therefore, Admiral Kimmel at Pearl Harbor, there is no one beyond him. So it all stops at some point. So it's about when you're making a claim in a book about blame and responsibility, it's how you use that language, because it's nuanced, isn't it? Responsibility and blame and at fault.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it's one of the things I brought up on my channel a few times. Sometimes when you're making this analysis, you have to make the distinction, as you said, between this is an explanation and this is an excuse. Because it's perfectly possible to explain why something happened or why someone made the decision that they did. That doesn't mean you're actually excusing what they said or did, or what they didn't do, or what they believed, or whatever, but you're just explaining why they did it. Whether or not that...
You're also cutting it off at a certain point. You're cutting it. If you allow it to go up, then you start investigating the whole way the US Navy operates. And then where do you stop? Do you start, sacking file clerks because they've not been putting orders? So if you kind of cut it, it's kind of cutting off, amputating a leg to save the patient, isn't it? Kind of Kimmel and those, they're kind of we'll cut it off there. Then the rest of the body that is the US Navy will be fine because we've amputated there. Does that make sense? Does that analogy work?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, that's the thing. And it's also, apart from anything else, it's also a morale issue. Because sailors, as we know, well, most people in the armed services generally can tend to be a bit of a superstitious lot, sailors especially. If you're in the US Navy, if you're being told, right, we're gonna go and we're gonna fight back, we're gonna take the fight to the Japanese, we're gonna get revenge to get for Pearl Harbor, and it's like, okay, great, who's in charge? The guy who let Pearl Harbor happen on his watch,
isn't it?
Yeah, your morale's going to crater at that point, regardless of responsibility.
So you tell the crews of the fleet that what happened there has been cured. He has gone now. This is a new fleet now. There's a new command structure in place. This is all the old baggage. We've left that behind. This is new. That's how you go out and motivate yourself. So, and I guess the fact is, when you get to an admiral's level of pay, you can kind of ride the fact that the increase in pay, the responsibility that goes with that is it's on your shoulders, and that you've got that far up the ladder. That it's your responsibility. So we're going off down a side conversation. I want to first I want to thank you for taking part in this. Before I come back and say goodbye to you, I want to do one more video, folks. And this shows this week, they're not sponsored by as such, but I want to highlight the work of the Stories Behind the Stars service I talked about at the beginning of the show, who are trying to get the stories of every one of the 421,000 Americans who fell in World War II, and they have a Pearl Harbor part of their page. So the link to their website is in the description below, but I'm going to just show their little promo video they sent me this morning. It's just 39 seconds, and then I'll come back and close off the show. So here you go with this little video I was sent.
about just a battle.
We were able to shine a light kind of on their lives and to let other people know who they were.
These stories really do come home. You get a greater degree of respect and closeness to these people that sacrifice so much.
So it's pretty simple there, folks. There's lots of you watching. They watch Drac's show who know your history. What they're asking is if you have some time as a researcher to investigate one or other of these Marines or airmen who died in World War II and try and put a story about how he met his end and go on their website. They want to create this database so that everybody in the future can look up and find out how their loved one, how the person from their school, their university met their end. And it's a wonderful idea, and it's all volunteers. Don Milne is the guy behind it, so he asked me if I would kind of show that, which of course I would. So I would urge you to go out there and investigate the websites in the description below. So there we are. So Drac, we could go around lots of more stuff on this, and I will have you and Alexander Clark back on at some point. We'll do another one of those round robin big panel discussions about something, because I want to acknowledge the 80th anniversary of various things next year in 2020. So there's lots of stuff in the Mediterranean we can tackle. There's lots of stuff Malaya way we could tackle if you want to come on. But right now we will bring it back to an end now. What are you up to with your channel right now? What are the projects you're in the middle of at the moment?
Oh, there's a fair number. So I've got my own video on mostly events surrounding Pearl Harbor, and also the account of someone who was actually there, which hopefully, editing going well, will go up tomorrow. There's got a couple of other interesting things coming up. I've got World War II U-boats on the Danube and the Rhine, and in the Black Sea. That's coming next week. And in the new year, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to visit Gibraltar and Jersey earlier this year, so I've got some fairly extensive specials coming up on that, including me almost killing myself walking up the rock 3 times. I do not advise it. Take the cable car. I only figured out that existed far too late.
Okay, right. We walked around the corner. Oh, there's a cable car. Damn. Yeah.
And other than that, Omicron and all the other variants that I'm sure will pop up at somewhere willing. Hopefully, I will be in the States for 3 weeks in April. Say hello to some viewers and go and visit the well, not all of them, but a number of the plethora of US museum ships that are out there.
And I know what the answer to this is going to be, because I get the question asked to me is like, have you got any limitation to the ideas for your shows in the future? And I can say no, a resounding no. I've got a list of shows, potential shows and things. So I'm guessing you're not anywhere near running out of things to talk about in terms of naval history.
No, the only restriction I have on my channel, and which is one that I think is pretty much going to stay for a very long time to come, is that I have a cutoff date of 1950. So World War II and before, fine. I'm not going to touch anything basically post-Korea. But to be honest, as you say, there's so much stuff beforehand. I'm not going to run out of material.
We have so much to talk about. I mean, the generally us who are doing history, Brad from On This Day in Canadian Military History. I mean, you could just spend a decade just discussing Hong Kong. How long would it take to discuss everything about Singapore, Malaya, Truk, Rabaul, all those places there, New Guinea campaign? I mean, I've got heavily into that recently. That's my latest thing, the Australians and the Americans out there. It's just unlimited amount of potential subjects we can tackle in the future. So I will be continuing on my channel. You'll be continuing on yours, and Alexander Clark on his, and Brad on his, and we just hope people stick with us. So right now, it is my pleasure to say thank you very much for being with us, and I will see you again soon. And folks, as I said earlier, I have nothing absolutely on the schedule for tomorrow, except I'm hoping to get these live interactions from Pearl Harbor. So kind of keep an eye out for your notifications on YouTube. And if I pop up with someone joining me from Pearl Harbor, it's likely to happen, more likely to be this time of day tomorrow, which will be morning over in Hawaii, or the morning, so the Europe morning of the 8th, which is the evening of the 7th out in Hawaii. So just keep an eye out if anything happens. It won't be very long. It'll be a few minutes. I'll be grabbing people in between their ceremonies and events, but maybe, fingers crossed, I'll get some more live footage from Pearl Harbor for you. But other than that, on Wednesday, we are back with the two brilliant guys, Robbie and Matt from Fighting on Film, where we're going to thrash out which is the best film about Pearl Harbor and which are the turkeys. Let's be honest, we all know in advance Tora is the best. And so it's I think who brings up the rear, I think, is where the debate will be when it comes to the Pearl Harbor movies. But I think number one place, we'll be going to be thrashing that out with those guys on Wednesday. As usual, don't forget to support what we're doing on YouTube. For those who've come to me from Drac's channel, please consider subscribing to mine. Consider becoming a patron or joining via YouTube membership. If I hear and you haven't found Drac's channel, go and find his channel. And we will see you all on both those channels later on. But right now, just thanks very much for joining us. And have you had a good time chatting to me and the folks, Drac?
Yes, definitely. It's always a pleasure to come on and have a chat with you. I hope you'll have me back at some point when you find something sufficiently
we'll definitely bring Alex back at some point as well. So, folks, that's it. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you all again on Wednesday, and I'll see you with some footage tomorrow. So thanks very much for watching. See you all again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.